All right, so today we're diving into some pretty fascinating territory, Islamic perspectives on homeownership
Oh, yeah.
in Western countries.
Yeah.
Specifically, like, how do you navigate the
Yeah.
complexities of interest-based loans when you're trying to stay true to your faith?
Right.
Get ready, because this deep dive into faith and finance is about to get really interesting.
It's a question so many Muslims are grappling with today, especially since owning a home is considered such a blessing in Islam.
Oh, totally.
But as you probably know, Islam also has this really strict prohibition against riba, which is interest.
Right.
So how do those two things reconcile, especially when you're living in a place where interest-based loans are just the standard?
Right. It's like this fundamental tension
Mhm.
between wanting a stable home, which Islam encourages,
Yeah,
and avoiding interest, which
Ooh.
Islam strictly forbids.
for sure.
We're looking at a question and answer session from an Islamic scholar's perspective,
Okay.
and it gets right to the heart of this dilemma. I was particularly struck by the arguments against long-term renting.
Yeah.
I mean, we all know it can be a financial strain, but I hadn't considered it from this angle before.
Yeah, that's one of the key points this scholar brings up.
Okay.
In Islam, there's this strong emphasis on stability and security.
Right.
Especially as you get older,
Mm-hmm.
renting long-term kind of puts you at the mercy of the landlord.
Yeah.
Rent could go up, you could be evicted.
Oh, for sure.
It's just not the same sense of ownership and peace of mind
Yeah.
that comes with having your own place.
Totally. And if you connect that to Islamic teachings about the home being a place of rest,
Right.
as the Quran describes it, it makes you realize that it's about more than just having a roof over your head.
For sure.
It's about creating a space where you can truly feel settled and secure,
Absolutely.
which is especially important when raising a family.
Exactly. And when you consider that so many Muslims simply can't afford to buy a home outright,
Oh, yeah.
you can see how they might feel stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Oh.
Unable to purchase a home without engaging with interest,
Right.
but also facing the insecurity and potential hardship of long-term renting.
Yeah. That's where this idea of necessity permits the prohibited comes into play, right?
Yes.
I know it's often used in discussions about dietary restrictions,
Yeah.
but it seems like it has much broader implications.
Absolutely. Islamic scholars have extended this principle to situations where hardship arises from not fulfilling a need,
Okay,
even if it's not like a life or death situation.
I see.
So the question then becomes, is home ownership considered a need, a necessity in this context?
And the scholar we're looking at seems to think so,
Right.
citing not only the Quranic verse about homes being a place of rest,
Right.
but also the Prophet Muhammad's own emphasis on spacious homes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What's fascinating here is that they go on to highlight a ruling from the European Fatwa Council,
Wow.
which actually permits Muslims in Europe to use interest-based loans for home purchases
Okay.
if they're facing a situation of necessity.
Wow. That's pretty significant.
It is.
You mentioned that this is just one interpretation.
Yeah,
Are there other schools of thought that have a different take on this?
there are. The Hanafi school, for instance, generally takes a more cautious approach.
Okay.
While they might acknowledge the necessity in certain cases,
Mm-hmm.
they really emphasize minimizing any involvement with interest at all.
Okay.
They're very focused on ensuring there's no harm or deceit to anyone involved in the loan process.
So even within those different viewpoints, it
Right.
seems like there's this understanding that modern life throws some curveballs,
Yeah.
and Islamic jurisprudence needs to be able to respond to those challenges
Mm-hmm.
in a way that upholds the core principles while also recognizing the realities people are facing.
That's a really insightful observation.
Thanks.
And it leads us to another crucial distinction the scholar makes.
Okay.
The difference between paying riba and consuming it.
Oh, okay.
Consuming riba, meaning directly benefiting from interest earned,
Gotcha.
is completely forbidden. But paying it, especially under duress,
Mm-hmm.
might be permissible as a kind of damage control measure.
Okay, I am following you. So in the context of homeownership, if you're paying interest on a loan,
Mm-hmm.
it could be seen as this necessary evil
Yeah.
to avoid the greater harm of being denied a stable home.
Exactly. The scholar argues that by prohibiting Muslims from these agreements,
Right.
you could actually create a situation where they're systematically disadvantaged compared to non-Muslims.
Interesting.
It's almost like they're forced to operate within a system
Yeah,
that puts them at a financial disadvantage
right.
just because they're adhering to their faith.
That raises some really important questions about fairness and how Islamic principles should be applied in a world where financial systems often clash with those principles.
Absolutely.
I'm eager to explore those questions further.
Let's do it. There's a lot more to unpack here.
It's wild how the scholar frames the potential consequences of just like completely prohibiting interest-based loans for Muslims.
Yeah.
They argue that it could weaken the economic position of the whole Muslim community.
Yeah, it's a point that's often overlooked. They cite the hadith that says Islam increases and does not diminish,
Right.
highlighting that Islamic rulings shouldn't lead to a decrease in well-being for Muslims.
Gotcha.
In fact, they should aim to empower them.
So if you prevent Muslims from using the same financial tools available to others,
Yeah.
particularly when it comes to something as essential as home ownership,
Right.
are you essentially creating a system where they're constantly paying without the chance to build equity and security?
Precisely. They could end up stuck in that cycle of renting,
Yeah.
facing high costs and instability,
Right.
while others around them are able to climb the property ladder and secure their financial futures.
It's almost like a hidden form of inequality,
Yeah.
where adherence to religious principles unintentionally puts you at a disadvantage within the existing economic system.
And it's not just about individual hardship.
Right.
The scholar points out that this has implications on like a systemic level.
Okay.
If Muslims are consistently excluded from participating in certain economic activities
Yeah.
due to religious restrictions, who benefits from that exclusion?
That's a really provocative question.
Yeah.
Are we talking about a situation where non-Muslims are inadvertently profiting from the limitations placed on Muslims?
It's a complex issue, but it's certainly worth considering.
Yeah.
It raises those fundamental questions about fairness and equity within a globalized economy, where financial systems are often at odds with those traditional Islamic values.
Earlier, we talked about that distinction between paying and consuming riba.
Right.
How does that play into this discussion about home ownership and potential economic disadvantage?
Remember, consuming riba, meaning profiting from interest, is absolutely forbidden.
Right.
But paying it, especially in situations of genuine need,
Yeah.
might be permissible as a form of damage control. The principle here is that you're choosing the lesser of two evils.
So let's say a Muslim family is facing eviction.
Yeah.
They've exhausted all other options and see an interest-based loan as the only way to secure a home and avoid homelessness.
Right.
In that situation, paying interest might be viewed as a necessary evil to prevent a greater harm.
Exactly. The scholar argues that prohibiting Muslims from these types of transactions in those specific situations could actually trap them in a cycle of financial instability and prevent them from achieving the very stability that Islam encourages.
I'm starting to understand how navigating this issue requires such a nuanced approach.
Yeah.
It's not about simply imposing a blanket ban on interest,
Right.
but about looking at the specific circumstances, weighing the potential harms, and choosing the path that aligns most closely with Islamic values while also considering the real-world consequences.
That's the heart of it. It requires that careful consideration and thoughtful dialogue.
Yeah.
It's about seeking solutions that uphold the spirit of Islamic teachings,
Right.
while also acknowledging those complexities of modern life.
This deep dive has really highlighted the challenges of balancing faith with modern financial realities.
For sure.
It makes you wonder, what role does Islamic scholarship play in helping Muslims navigate these types of dilemmas?
It's a crucial role. Islamic scholars need to engage deeply with those contemporary issues and offer guidance that is both grounded in Islamic principles and relevant to the lived experiences of Muslims today.
It's not about simply reciting those ancient rules, but about applying them in a way that makes sense in the context of a world that's constantly changing and evolving.
Absolutely. This case study of homeownership and interest-based loans is a perfect example of how Islamic jurisprudence needs to be dynamic and responsive to the challenges faced by Muslims in a globalized world.
And it reminds us that there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Nope.
These are complex issues that require that thoughtful reflection and ongoing discussion.
Precisely.
Hey.
What stands out to you most from this conversation? What resonates with your own experiences?
I think what struck me the most was the idea that strict adherence to certain principles without considering the context of potential consequences could actually lead to outcomes that contradict the broader spirit of those very principles.
It's a profound insight.
Yeah.
And it highlights the need for a nuanced and compassionate approach to Islamic jurisprudence.
It seems like this conversation is just scratching the surface.
For sure.
Are there other situations where this kind of re-examination of traditional interpretations might be needed?
There are countless examples. The world is changing rapidly.
Yeah.
And Muslim communities are facing new challenges all the time.
Right.
This requires ongoing dialogue and a willingness to engage with those difficult questions.
I think it's time for us to pause here and gather our thoughts.
Okay.
This has been a really stimulating discussion.
Let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned and then come back to wrap things up.
Welcome back to our deep dive. We've been exploring Islamic perspectives on homeownership and how to navigate the complexities of interest-based loans in a Western context. I don't know about you, but I am finding this whole conversation incredibly eye-opening.
For sure.
It's making me rethink some of my assumptions about Islamic finance.
Yeah, it's been a really rich discussion, hasn't it?
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground,
Totally.
starting with that absolute prohibition of riba,
Right.
and then moving into the principle of necessity,
Right.
which seems to offer a bit more flexibility.
Yeah.
And then we looked at that really interesting ruling from the European Fatwa Council.
Right. I was particularly struck by how they weighed the potential harm of excluding Muslims from the mortgage system against the principle of avoiding interest.
Right.
It seems like they really tried to balance those competing concerns and find a solution that works for Muslims living in a society where homeownership is so often tied to mortgages.
It really speaks to the idea that Islamic jurisprudence isn't static. It has to adapt to the changing circumstances of the modern world.
Yeah.
It's like this ongoing conversation between core principles and the realities people face in their daily lives.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways you hope our listener will walk away with?
Well, first and foremost, I want to emphasize that the prohibition against riba is a fundamental principle in Islam.
Right.
It's not something to be taken lightly or dismissed as outdated. It's rooted in a deep commitment to justice and ensuring fairness in all financial dealings.
But as we've seen, there are situations where applying that principle might require some careful consideration and a nuanced approach. The principle of necessity, for example, highlights that Islam recognizes that there are times when strict adherence to a rule could lead to greater harm.
Exactly. And the European Fatwa Council's ruling is a great example of how scholars are grappling with these modern dilemmas.
Totally.
They acknowledge the unique challenges faced by Muslims in a system where homeownership is often tied to interest-based financing and made a decision based on the specific needs of that community.
Even within the Hanafi school, which we talked about earlier, there's this recognition that avoiding harm and deception is paramount. It seems like there's a real emphasis on finding solutions that uphold the spirit of Islamic teachings while also being sensitive to the practical realities people face.
That's a great way to put it. It's about finding that balance between principle and pragmatism.
Right.
Sometimes the most faithful approach is the one that results in the greatest good.
Yeah.
And minimizes harm, both for the individual and the community as a whole.
I think this deep dive has shown just how dynamic and relevant Islamic jurisprudence is.
For sure.
It's constantly evolving and engaging with contemporary issues.
Yeah.
It's not just about abstract rules.
Right.
It's about providing practical guidance for how to live an ethical and fulfilling life in a complex world.
And that's what makes it so fascinating to study and to apply in our lives.
Right.
It's a continuous journey of learning and growth.
As we leave our listener to ponder all this, is there a final thought you'd like to leave them with?
Well, this deep dive has shown us that Islamic scholars are constantly wrestling with real-world dilemmas.
Yeah.
Trying to find that balance between core principles and modern challenges.
Right.
It makes you wonder what other areas might benefit from this kind of re-examination. Are there other situations where the changing landscape of our world requires us to revisit traditional interpretations and perhaps find new understandings that are both rooted in the spirit of Islam and relevant to the lives of Muslims today?
That's a powerful question to consider. It reminds us that learning is a lifelong journey.
For sure.
And engaging with these challenging issues is an essential part of living a meaningful life guided by faith.
Indeed. And it's through these conversations, through this willingness to grapple with these tough questions, that we can grow as individuals and as a community.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Islamic perspectives on homeownership. We hope it has inspired you to continue exploring these complex and fascinating issues.
It's been a pleasure. Until next time, keep seeking knowledge.
Okay.
Keep asking those difficult questions.
Right.
And remember, there's always more to discover beneath the surface